The world was plunged into chaos on an unassuming day when a ripple in the global financial system sent shockwaves through the stock market. The day started like any other. Markets opened, numbers surged, and traders spoke in their usual cryptic jargon. But as the hours ticked by, the unthinkable happened. A massive sell-off, nearly impossible to trace, swept through the global economy. Among the epicenter of this collapse stood a name no one expected: BlackRock. The firm had quietly risen to unprecedented heights, owning everything from the world's largest companies to vast swaths of property. The world's financial system, its lifeblood, was suddenly exposed, revealing a reality where one company held the reins. Was this the end of the free market as we knew it, or just the beginning of a new, darker era? The tension was palpable in every office, every home, as eyes turned to the one company that seemed untouchable. Inside BlackRock's glass and steel headquarters, Robert Callaway, the firm's CEO, sat at the head of a long polished conference table. His mind raced, analyzing every piece of the puzzle that had fallen apart so swiftly. BlackRock's empire, built over decades, was now under siege. Their holdings were vast, enough to dictate the future of entire industries. It had taken years to reach this point of control, this apex of power, but in a single day, it seemed like it could all come crashing down. His assistant Martha entered the room with the latest reports in hand, her face pale. "Sir, it's worse than we thought," she said, her voice shaking. Robert's gaze hardened. He took a deep breath, a moment of calm before the storm. "We can't let it fall apart now, not after everything we've built." Martha stood beside Robert as the reports continued to pour in. The situation was rapidly spiraling. News outlets had begun to speculate that BlackRock might be at the center of a conspiracy to manipulate global markets. The rumors spread like wildfire, sending shockwaves through the financial community. Outside, protesters began to gather, chanting angrily for justice. "It's the end of the world, isn't it?" she asked softly. Robert didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared out the large glass windows of his office, where the chaos of the world outside was now reflected back at him. "It's only just begun," he said coldly. The firm had weathered storms before, but this was different. The consequences would be far-reaching, not just for BlackRock, but for everyone. The camera cut to the streets where thousands of protesters were gathering outside BlackRock's headquarters, chanting slogans demanding accountability. News trucks lined the streets, broadcasting live images of the financial revolution unfolding. The people had had enough. For too long they had felt powerless, while the world's wealth continued to concentrate in the hands of a few. BlackRock had become the symbol of everything wrong with the global financial system. As the crowd grew, tensions escalated. Barricades were erected around the building, and security forces prepared for the worst. Robert watched the scene unfold on a large screen inside his office, his expression unreadable. He had always known this day would come. He just didn't expect it to arrive so soon. In the midst of the chaos, Robert received an unexpected call. The voice on the other end was calm, but there was an urgency in it. "We have a situation," the voice said. "BlackRock's actions have triggered something far more dangerous. There's a ripple effect we didn't anticipate." Robert's brow furrowed as he listened intently, the weight of the words sinking in. It wasn't just about the market anymore. It was about something much deeper. The firm's every move had set off a chain reaction that was about to engulf the global economy. "What do you suggest?" Robert asked, his voice steady. "We need to move fast," came the response. "If we don't act now, we could lose everything." The tension in BlackRock's headquarters reached a boiling point as the firm's executives scrambled to make sense of the financial disaster unfolding before them. Robert Callaway stood at the center of it all, his hands gripping the edge of the conference table as he watched the live broadcast of the protests outside. The murmurs among the other board members grew louder, their faces pale with fear and uncertainty. Martha entered with a grim report. "We've just learned that some of our largest stakeholders are considering pulling their investments," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Robert's eyes narrowed. "We can't let that happen. We must contain this. If they pull out, we're done." As the room filled with a sense of impending doom, Robert's mind raced. There had to be a way to stabilize the company, to reassure their investors. The walls were closing in, but Robert knew there was no turning back now. Robert walked out onto the balcony, his gaze fixed on the protesters below. The chants were growing louder, the energy palpable. It was as if the entire city had united, in opposition to everything BlackRock represented. He couldn't help but feel the weight of their anger. The people saw BlackRock as the enemy, a symbol of unchecked corporate power, and now the firm was facing the consequences of its decades-long dominance. But Robert wasn't one to back down. He had worked too hard to build BlackRock into the behemoth it was, and he wasn't about to let it crumble because of public outrage. He turned to Martha, who had followed him outside. "We need a plan. We need to regain control before it's too late." Martha nodded, her face tense. "We can try damage control, but it might not be enough. The damage has already been done." As the hours passed, the situation continued to deteriorate. Robert returned to his office, feeling the pressure mounting with every passing minute. The media had caught wind of BlackRock's struggle, and soon, every major news outlet was covering the crisis. He watched a live broadcast of a financial analyst discussing the potential collapse of the firm. The words "BlackRock on the brink of collapse" echoed in his mind, and he knew this wasn't just about money anymore. It was about survival. In a quiet moment, he turned to Martha. "We need to control the narrative. If the public believes we're too big to fail, we can survive this. We need to find a way to reassure them." Martha looked uncertain. "But what if it's too late? What if the damage is already irreversible?" Robert met her gaze with steely resolve. "We push forward. We find a way. We have no other choice." Outside, the protests had turned violent. The chants of "Down with BlackRock" had transformed into shattered windows and burning barricades. Robert sat in his office, watching in horror as the images flashed across the screen. The financial storm was no longer confined to the markets. It was now in the streets. Security forces had been called in to protect the building, but Robert knew that wouldn't be enough to stop the tide of fury that was rising. A call came through. "Sir, we need to evacuate. The situation is becoming uncontrollable." Robert hesitated, his fingers hovering over the phone. If he left now, it would be a public admission of defeat. But staying meant putting his life, and his company's reputation, on the line. "No," he said firmly. "We stay. This is our company, and we're not running from it." He stood up, facing the team that had been with him for years, ready to fight until the very end. As the night wore on, the pressure reached its peak. Inside the BlackRock building, the team scrambled to formulate a plan to stop the company's collapse, but each new report only seemed to make the situation worse. Robert walked through the halls of the building, passing by employees who were glued to their phones, eyes wide with fear. The world outside was collapsing, and they were all caught in its wake. Robert couldn't shake the feeling that something more sinister was at play. Was this a coincidence, or had someone planned this disaster from the start? He knew BlackRock had made enemies, but he never imagined it could escalate this far. He turned to Martha, who was standing at the edge of the room. "We need answers. We need to find out who's behind this." Martha nodded solemnly. "I'll look into it right away." Robert's eyes hardened as he faced the looming crisis. "We're not going down without a fight." The next morning, Robert sat in his office, facing a growing storm on all fronts. The protests outside had escalated overnight. News outlets had dug deeper into BlackRock's financial dealings, exposing controversial investments and suggesting the firm had manipulated the market for years. Robert's phone was ringing off the hook, calls from stakeholders, lawyers, and the media. Every conversation seemed to spiral into panic. His head throbbed as he read through yet another ominous message. The firm's stock had plummeted even further. It was no longer just about the protests. BlackRock was losing credibility. Martha stood in the doorway looking more fatigued than ever. "The board wants answers, Robert," she said quietly. "They're talking about a restructuring plan, and some are considering stepping down." Robert leaned back in his chair, frustration washing over him. We don't have time for that. We need to fight back. If we let them see us falter now, it's over. Robert's thoughts raced as he prepared to address the board. He had spent years building BlackRock into an empire, and now he was facing the most critical moment of his career. His hands shook slightly as he gripped the edges of the conference table. He knew the board members were already divided. Some were pushing for a public apology, while others wanted a more aggressive stance. Robert wasn't about to let this company crumble on his watch. "We can't back down," he said firmly, standing up to face the room. "We've built this empire on bold decisions, and now is the time to show we're still in control." He paused, glancing around the table. "We're going to turn this around, but it starts with us standing our ground. We'll face the consequences, but we won't be cowed." The board members exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement, others still uncertain. Robert knew it wasn't going to be easy, but it was the only way forward. As the meeting ended, Robert stepped out into the hallway, his mind still spinning. He had to stay in control, for the sake of the company and his own sanity. But the pressure was beginning to take its toll. As he walked toward his office, he saw the media frenzy outside, cameras flashing as reporters shoved microphones toward any BlackRock employee who dared to step out. His every move was being scrutinized. A call came through. It was Martha again. "We've just received information that there's been a coordinated effort to destabilize BlackRock. Someone is orchestrating this." Robert stopped in his tracks, the weight of her words sinking in. A coordinated attack? It wasn't just public outrage, it was an inside job. "Who's behind it?" he asked, his voice low. "We're working on it," Martha replied. "But it's getting worse. We're running out of time." Robert's grip on the phone tightened. This wasn't just a financial crisis, it was a war. Back in his office, Robert sat behind his desk, eyes scanning the latest intel. The coordinated attacks were becoming clearer. BlackRock's most powerful adversaries, rivals in the financial world, disgruntled former employees, and even members of his own board, had been feeding information to the media, each leak designed to trigger panic. The goal was to bring BlackRock to its knees. He slammed his fist on the desk in frustration. How could they have let it get this far? He called for an emergency meeting with his closest advisors. "We need to identify the source of these leaks, and we need to do it fast. If we can control the flow of information, we can regain some leverage." Martha nodded grimly. "We'll have to dig deeper. There are too many potential suspects." Robert looked out the window, his mind focused. "No one leaves this building until we figure this out." It was clear now, BlackRock was in a battle for its very survival. As the investigation into the leaks continued, Robert realized the situation had escalated beyond anything he had anticipated. The financial media had latched onto the story, feeding the flames of outrage. BlackRock's stock plummeted further, and now, even the most loyal investors were pulling out. The pressure inside the building was suffocating, with employees growing more anxious by the hour. As Robert walked through the offices, he could feel the weight of every eye on him. The company was spiraling, and it was becoming harder to convince anyone that there was a way out. But Robert refused to give in. He couldn't. He wasn't going to let years of hard work be destroyed by a few orchestrated leaks. "We're still BlackRock," he muttered under his breath. "We can survive this." But even as he spoke, a nagging fear began to settle in the pit of his stomach. What if it was already too late? The walls of BlackRock's headquarters felt like they were closing in. Robert's mind raced as he prepared for the inevitable meeting with the board. The leaks had done their damage, and now rumors swirled like wildfire. The company was in freefall. As the minutes ticked by, Robert glanced around the room at his closest advisors. He could see the fear in their eyes. A few days ago, they had been confident. But now, every move they made was scrutinized under a magnifying glass. The media had made them villains, and there was no hiding from it. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Martha, looking more stressed than ever. "The board is ready to meet," she said, her voice tight. Robert exhaled slowly. "Let's do this." The weight of BlackRock's future rested on this meeting. Would they stand together, or would the cracks begin to show? The boardroom was filled with murmurs as the meeting began. Robert took his place at the head of the table, his eyes scanning the room. He could feel the pressure mounting. He had always prided himself on his ability to lead, but now, doubt lingered in the air. The first few minutes were filled with reports on the financial losses, the stock price plummeting, and the damage to BlackRock's reputation. Then a board member spoke up, his voice trembling with frustration. "We can't keep going like this," he said. "The damage is too much. We need to consider drastic measures, maybe even liquidate some of our assets." Robert's heart sank. Liquidation. This was not the answer. "No," he said, cutting through the tension. "We fight. We don't give up on this company. Not now." The room fell silent, everyone unsure of what would happen next. The meeting continued for hours, with heated discussions about BlackRock's survival. Robert's mind raced, but he refused to back down. If he gave in now, it would be the end, not just for him, but for everything he had built. As the board members bickered, Robert's thoughts turned inward. How had it come to this? A coordinated attack, financial ruin, protests on the streets. It all felt like a conspiracy designed to tear down everything he had worked for. In the midst of the chaos, Robert received a call from one of his most trusted advisors. "Robert," the voice said urgently, "we've uncovered something you need to know. Someone within the company is working against you. They're feeding information to the media. This is no accident." Robert's blood ran cold. A traitor in their midst. He couldn't believe it. The company's destruction was now coming from the inside. As the call ended, Robert stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He felt a surge of adrenaline. Betrayal. The very idea that someone within BlackRock, someone who had been a part of his success, was sabotaging the company filled him with rage. The board members, noticing his sudden movement, grew quiet. "Who's responsible?" Robert demanded. His voice was low, yet laced with authority. "We don't know yet, but we'll find out," Martha responded, her voice shaky. Robert's eyes hardened. "We can't let this stand. Whoever is behind this will pay the price. We are BlackRock, and we're not going to let anyone destroy us from within." The room was still, a silent agreement hanging in the air. But Robert knew the path ahead was fraught with danger. The real fight had just begun. The discovery of the traitor set off a series of rapid events. Robert called an emergency meeting with his closest advisors and a team of cybersecurity experts. They needed to track down the leak and root out the mole before it could do any more damage. As they pieced together the information, it became clear that someone had been strategically leaking confidential data to rival firms and the media. The betrayal was far-reaching. But who could it be? Robert sat in his office, his thoughts racing. The weight of the situation was unbearable. This was no longer just about saving the company. It was about exposing a hidden enemy within their ranks. As he stared at the wall of monitors in his office, a realization hit him. The traitor might be someone he had trusted the most. His heart sank. Could it be possible? Was this all part of a larger plan to take down BlackRock? Robert sat in his office, the silence hanging heavy in the air. The discovery of the traitor had sent shockwaves through BlackRock. He could still feel the betrayal seeping into every corner of the firm. His trust had been shattered. But now he had a clear mission: expose the traitor and reclaim control of BlackRock. His team worked tirelessly, pulling every thread they could find, trying to piece together the identity of the mole. The deeper they dug, the more the tension grew. There were whispers among the employees, suspicions swirling, but no concrete answers yet. As the hours passed, Robert's thoughts turned inward. Could he have prevented this? Could he have seen the signs? "We have to act quickly," he murmured to himself, gripping the edge of his desk. The company's fate hung in the balance, and Robert knew the time was coming to make his move. The investigation had narrowed the suspects down to a handful of employees. Robert stared at the list of names, the faces of those he had trusted for years, now shrouded in suspicion. He couldn't shake the feeling that the traitor was closer than he thought. The company's future depended on the identity of the mole being revealed. Robert was determined to find out, no matter the cost. He gathered his closest advisors for a final strategy session. "We need to take action now," he said, his voice firm. "I want every lead investigated. No one leaves the building until we find the person responsible." His team nodded in agreement, but Robert could see the fear in their eyes. They all knew what was at stake. A betrayal this deep could destroy everything they had built. Time was running out, and Robert knew that once the truth was exposed, things would never be the same. The hours seemed to stretch into eternity as the investigation intensified. Robert remained locked in his office, waiting for updates. Each passing minute felt like a small eternity, and the pressure was beginning to crack even his composure. The door opened with a soft click, and Martha stepped inside, holding a folder in her hand. Robert didn't need to ask, he could see it in her eyes. "We found him," Martha said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. The words hit Robert like a punch to the gut. The mole was one of the senior executives, someone he had trusted implicitly. "How?" Robert whispered, his voice hoarse. Martha handed him the folder, her face grim. "We traced the leaks back to his accounts. The evidence is clear." Robert's mind raced, disbelief mixing with a surge of anger. "We need to confront him now," he said, his voice cold. "This ends today." The confrontation was set. Robert and Martha entered the senior executive's office, the weight of the moment settling on their shoulders. The executive, Mark Fitzgerald, looked up from his desk, his face neutral, as if he hadn't been caught in the act of betrayal. But Robert could see it in his eyes, the guilt, the fear. "You betrayed us," Robert said, his voice low but filled with venom. Mark's expression faltered for just a moment before he regained his composure. "It wasn't personal, Robert," he said, his voice calm. "You were blinded by your own power. I did what I had to do." Robert's hands clenched into fists. "You destroyed everything we've worked for. You sabotaged BlackRock for your own gain." Mark didn't flinch. "You can't stop what's already been set in motion. The system was always rigged in your favor. I just gave it a little nudge." The words stung, but Robert knew one thing for sure. Mark would pay for his treachery. The confrontation with Mark was just the beginning. As the truth came to light, the fallout was swift. BlackRock had been irrevocably damaged, but Robert was determined to salvage what he could. The public relations crisis was impossible to ignore, but they had no choice but to address it head-on. Robert called a press conference, knowing that it was his last chance to regain any semblance of control. As the cameras flashed and the reporters clamored for answers, Robert stepped up to the podium. "I am here to take full responsibility for the actions of those within BlackRock who betrayed our trust," he said, his voice steady but filled with regret. "We will rebuild. We will make right what has been broken." The words were hollow, but they were all he had. As the press conference ended, Robert felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. BlackRock's future was uncertain, but Robert had made a choice. He would fight to the very end. In the days following the press conference, Robert's life felt like it was on a razor's edge. BlackRock's future was teetering on the brink of collapse, and the weight of his decisions weighed heavily on him. The fallout from the betrayal was far-reaching, with public trust in the company shattered. Investors were pulling out at an alarming rate, and the firm's stock continued to plummet. Inside the building, employees walked with their heads down, uncertain of what the next day would bring. Robert knew he had to act fast, but every move seemed to make the situation worse. The walls felt like they were closing in on him. His mind raced with ideas, but every path led to a dead end. In a quiet moment of reflection, Robert stared out the window, watching the world continue to turn despite the chaos in his own life. "This wasn't supposed to happen," he muttered to himself. "I never thought it would come to this." In the midst of the crisis, a new threat emerged. The media, already in a frenzy, began to focus on another angle, the potential for a full-scale government investigation into BlackRock's practices. The very institutions that had once turned a blind eye to the firm's influence were now calling for transparency, and whispers of a probe into BlackRock's operations circulated in the halls of power. Robert's phone rang constantly, but it was a call from the Department of Justice that stood out. "We have a few questions," the voice on the other end said, cold and clinical. "Expect a formal inquiry." As Robert hung up the phone, he realized that this was no longer just a financial crisis, it was a legal and political one. The ground beneath him was shifting rapidly, and Robert knew that without a drastic change, BlackRock could face criminal charges. He looked at his team, who were equally as shaken, knowing that their future was now in jeopardy. As the government investigation loomed, Robert was forced into a corner. He had been a powerful figure for so long, but now the tables had turned. His every move was under the microscope. The media frenzy showed no signs of slowing down, and it seemed like every day brought new revelations about BlackRock's controversial dealing. The public outcry was deafening. Robert called an emergency meeting with his legal team and advisors. "We need to prepare for the worst," he said, his voice steady but filled with the weight of reality. "If this investigation goes public, we could lose everything. We need to control the narrative before it's too late." Martha, standing across the table from him, nodded solemnly. "We'll need a complete internal audit, but we also need to start mending relationships with investors. The perception of BlackRock is more important than ever." Robert's mind raced as the weight of the situation crashed down on him. "Do whatever it takes," he said, his voice hardening. "We can't lose this fight." The internal audit began immediately, but the pressure of it all was overwhelming. Every document, every transaction, was now under a microscope. Robert watched as his team pored over data, trying to uncover any evidence that could help clear BlackRock's name. But the more they dug, the more it seemed like there was no clean slate to be found. The investigation into BlackRock's operations wasn't just about transparency. It was about exposing the dirty secrets that had been hidden for years. Robert paced the floor of his office, frustration boiling inside him. "If we don't find something, we're finished," he muttered. But deep down he feared they might not find anything to save them. The media was relentless, and every news scandal uncovered seemed to push BlackRock further toward the edge. Robert couldn't shake the feeling that the firm's collapse was imminent. "What's the point of all this?" he asked aloud, but no one had an answer. As the investigation dragged on, Robert found himself alone more often. The constant pressure was taking its toll, and even those closest to him seemed distant, as if unsure of how to support him in this moment of crisis. The legal team had found nothing that could definitively clear BlackRock, and the media kept pushing out new, damning stories. Investors were fleeing in droves, and Robert's phone was filled with calls from worried board members. Yet, even in the midst of all this chaos, Robert knew there was one final move he could make. "I've fought too hard to let it end like this," he whispered to himself. With one last chance to salvage everything, Robert made the decision to speak directly to the public again. A live interview was arranged, and Robert prepared to lay out the truth. This was his last shot to restore some semblance of control, to save the legacy of BlackRock. But would it be enough? Only time would tell. The day of the interview arrived. Robert stood in front of the cameras, the weight of the world pressing down on his shoulders. The room was filled with bright lights, and the low hum of cameras being adjusted. Outside, the media circus had only grown louder, their relentless questions echoing through every news channel. But today Robert knew that his words could either save BlackRock or seal its fate. He had spent days preparing for this moment, rehearsing his speech, but now that he stood before the cameras, everything seemed uncertain. As he sat down for the interview, the host's piercing gaze met his. "Mr. Calloway, BlackRock's future is on the line. What can you say to restore confidence?" Robert took a deep breath, the calmest he had felt in days, and began. "What has happened is not the BlackRock we intended to build. But I stand here today, not to hide from our mistakes, but to take responsibility." His voice, though steady, revealed the immense struggle within. Robert's words rang through the airwaves, and the world was watching. "We've made mistakes and I've learned from them," he continued. "But BlackRock isn't just a company. It's a symbol of what can be achieved when we come together. It's not too late to fix the wrongs we've done, to rebuild trust and transparency." For a moment, it felt as though the world held its breath. The interview was a turning point, but Robert knew this was only the beginning of a long road ahead. The pressure of the public's gaze was suffocating, yet for the first time in weeks, Robert felt a glimmer of hope. The road to redemption would be long and fraught with challenges, but at least he had taken the first step. As the interview ended, Robert stood, his face slightly less tense, but still weary from the weight of the situation. "We can rebuild," he repeated to himself, a mantra, knowing that the real fight would begin once the cameras stopped rolling. The aftermath of the interview left Robert with mixed emotions, and the public reaction was immediate, with some praising his candidness and others dismissing it as too little, too late. News outlets debated whether BlackRock could truly recover, and social media was flooded with opinions. But for Robert, the true test was in the boardroom. The board members, once divided and uncertain, now looked at him with a different kind of scrutiny. The question wasn't whether BlackRock could survive, it was whether it would ever regain its former stature. "This is just the beginning," Robert told the board, his voice more resolute than it had been in weeks. "We have a long road ahead of us, but we can start by making changes from within. Transparency, accountability. We owe it to the world and ourselves." The room remained silent for a moment before the first nods of agreement emerged. Robert knew the road to recovery would be long, but it had started with that one statement. Weeks passed, and while BlackRock's public image had taken a major hit, Robert's efforts to bring change from within were beginning to bear fruit. The company's internal audit had revealed cracks in the foundation, but it also allowed for reform. The media storm had begun to calm, and investors were cautiously starting to return. However, the true test lay ahead, regaining the trust of the public. Robert had no illusions about the challenges that lay ahead. "This will take time," he said to Martha one evening, looking out over the skyline from his office. "But we'll get there. BlackRock will rise again." Martha nodded, though her expression was more guarded. "It's not going to be easy. There are still many who won't forgive us." Robert exhaled slowly. "I know, but this time we'll do it right. We'll earn that trust back." The road was still long, but Robert was no longer afraid of the journey. He was ready for whatever came next. Months later, BlackRock was still rebuilding, but the company had found its footing again. Robert stood before a crowd of reporters at another press conference. The atmosphere was different this time. There was no frenzy, no fiery questions demanding answers. Instead, there was a quiet sense of expectation. Robert spoke with a calm confidence that had been absent in the earlier days of the crisis. "We've learned from our mistakes," he said, his voice steady. "And while we are not where we want to be yet, we are on the path to restoring what was lost." As he finished his speech, Robert felt a quiet sense of pride. The company was far from perfect, but it was healing. He had fought, and BlackRock had survived. And in that moment, as the cameras clicked and the reporters scribbled, Robert finally felt the weight lift. The journey wasn't over, but BlackRock had endured the storm, and so had he.